as a rental company, you're essentially a bank and your currency is equipment.
You need to mix up your fleets. You need to have a great story.
If you look at any good NFL team, college team, they got to be good at the basics before they start running the trick plays.
You have to know the rental business. You have to be able to explain why you're going to be successful while other people aren't. If you care for the success of others, they're going to care for your success as well. And we raise the entire bar as an industry.
Yeah. Yeah. Keep coming with it. Keep coming with it. Keep coming with it. Place your bets on nuts. Get your money and flip it.
All right, everyone, welcome to the Rental Roundtable, episode number 101. We've got on Gary Stansberry. He's the owner of the Stansberry Firm in San Antonio, Texas. Gary, welcome to the show today.
Thanks for having me, Kyle. Nice to meet you at the rental show a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, we got to talk at our booth for a while on Wednesday at the ARA show. It's a little bit slower on Wednesday, of course, but we've done 101 episodes, which sounds like a lot. And you've done even more rental transactions, right? So 140. I thought we had a lot of podcast episodes. By the way, an hour-long podcast episode is much easier than a full M&A transaction. So a lot of credit to the work you've been doing in the industry.
Yeah, it's a lot of times people, think what I'm doing is sexy or whatever. And I always say it's like the old thing about sausage getting made. You really don't want to see what happens behind the scenes. And I mean, so much of it is the grind of reviewing legal documents and putting financials together. And there might be 10% sexy and 90% non-sexy to put an M&A deal together.
Yes, I imagine the amount of work. And I think about how much work we've done for this podcast, which is 101 episodes. And it is less than 1% of the work you do going into a full M&A transaction. So bad news for you is we're doing one a week. So in the next year, we're going to cross 150, then 200. So you got to keep up your M&A's track record, which would be a little bit harder given the amount of work that goes into that.
Yeah, especially these days. I mean, definitely the market has slowed down. And I know that, some of the podcasts in your 2026 rental report kind of reference that. It's pretty fast and furious there post-COVID. I had 2 particular months that I closed 3 transactions within a period of days. So I don't have any such thing coming up in the immediate future, I'm afraid.
Yes,
Maybe good news, maybe bad news.
Well, things are cyclical for sure. We were in a boom cycle for a little bit after COVID, but we're going to talk a lot today about the M&A process. Talk about, can independent rental companies survive? You wrote an article about that a couple of years ago about how rental companies really need to step their game up in their level of sophistication. We'll talk about that in a second, but I'd love to hear about your story. How did you get into the rental industry? What were you doing before this? And why did you decide to start the Stansberry Firm?
Okay. So I'm a CPA. I got an accounting degree from TCU in Fort Worth. I'm a lifelong Texan. I went to work for Deloitte out of college, and I ended up getting assigned to a client that was in the oil field service industry. And I would say that of my time at Deloitte, I spent almost 50% of my time at that particular client. And I really enjoy so I left Deloitte and I went to work for this client. And one thing about the oil field service business that I really liked is the can-do attitude of the people. And when I got put in charge of a division, it was the wireline services division. And wireline services is where you run a tool down into the hole and you take a map of the well and figure out where the producing zones are and that kind of thing. But these job sites, if you will, these well sites are a lot like a construction site. You have this finite period of time where all of this man and material and machines come together, and there's different vendors and there's different people, and you've all got to do your job, and you got to make sure your equipment's working and you're on the ball, and and trying to get the thing done. And it's kind of like a construction project. A construction project may not be as fast and furious, but those guys out in the field really had that attitude of, we're going to make this happen, we're going to get this done, and so forth. And unfortunately, in the oil field business, there's a lot of ups and downs. And the company that I work for, there was a down in the market, and they got hit particularly hard, and I ended up having to leave there. And the thing that I found after that was I went to work for a construction equipment dealership. It was the Komatsu dealer in Dallas, and boy, all of a sudden, these are my people. It's that same can-do attitude of delivering equipment, delivering a service, and servicing your customer. And when I first got there, we were strictly a dealership, sales, parts, service. And we were owned by a larger company up in Michigan that had an active rental segment. So we started a rental segment at the dealership, and boy, it just took off almost immediately and just did really well. And I've always kind of been an entrepreneur. I'd started a business to put myself through college, and I I looked at this and I said, "Hey, I think this is something I can do." So we had a lender that, let's just say that, some of the lesser credit they would look at helping finance. And I mean, I'm a young guy, I'm in my early 30s, and I had another guy that I worked with that was kind of interested in doing this. So I approached that lender and say, "Hey, would you potentially back us on a rental startup?" And man, they gave us a $250,000 line of credit. And boy, at that time, that just sounded like, boy, we could go to town. Now, things were a lot different back then. And I kind of referenced this in the article. Back then, we found a contractor that was willing to lease us some space. And, we bought 4 or 5 machines. We had a very targeted market, and kind of like it had taken off at the dealership, it started taking off with us. And, this lender saw, hey, these guys buy equipment, they can find a home for it rental wise. And, we started getting bigger and bigger and established a name out there, and had other lenders finally, these are some of the same lenders. I knocked on their door and they said no. All of a sudden, now that you've got some equipment out there, we're willing to take a risk with you. And so we built a decent sized rental fleet. Had a lot of debt. I had a client tell me one time later on, he said, what the only ship meant to sink was, and he said, that's a partnership. And I had a less than ideal partner, and it became evident that after a while that, from a financial standpoint, he probably wasn't the right partner. So we said one of the two of us got to buy the other one out. So he ended up buying me out. And shortly after that, I found my way to a company called RSC Equipment Rental. And RSC was in the very first stages of really becoming a national presence. I got an interview actually through a contact I had in the oil field service business with the CEO, a guy named Marty Reed. And I go out to RSC to their corporate headquarters. I was expecting a 12-story building in suburban Phoenix, and man, it's at a strip shopping center, and there's a lunchroom with 12 seats at the table, and they order in lunch every day, and the whole corporate staff sits there and have lunch. So here I am interviewing and have lunch with the entire corporate staff, including the CEO. So they, with my financial background, with my rental background, he said, what I want you to do is I want you to go and scout out rental companies for us to buy. So he gave me some geographies to start with. I did a lot of driving around, internet not so great during that time period. I mean, I would literally go to the public library and look at phone books and figure out rental companies and kind of grade them and say, hey, this is one that looks pretty good from the street, and this is one we're probably not interested in. And so then after I kind of delivered that work product, he said, all right, well, I want you to call the top 5 on your list there, see if they're interested in selling. So I did. And one thing with RSC, that was a pretty heady time during the acquisitions, the very first round of acquisitions. And I used to say during that time period, the fax machine was the mode of communication. If you had a fax machine and you could fax out your financial statements to 7 different acquirers and potentially have 7 different offers. Sorry, I got a new set of earphones and they're not fitting quite how I'd hoped. So I mean, it was that kind of market at the time. And there were some companies out there that were strictly looking for points on the map. And Marty said to me, he says, we really want to do this the right way. We want to buy companies that are worth buying. So my job would be is to develop a rapport with the rental store owner, hopefully go in and meet with them, look at their financials and say, hey, this is what they're doing right. This is what they're doing wrong. This is how it would fit into one of our operations. This is where we could potentially improve things and, figure out if it was a target. And if so, then start the process. So I did about 20 transactions with RSC over a couple of years. And, I was on a transaction in Kentucky, believe it or not. And, had developed a rapport with the rental store owner. And he called me up one day and he says, Gary, I got some good news and I got some bad news. He said, the bad news is I've decided to go with a company called Nations Rent. And the good news is I told them that they should hire you. So next thing you know, I got a call from Nations Rent and went to work for them. And, um, it was a little bit different environment. I felt like it was maybe more of a dots on the map as opposed to, and we definitely bought some good operations, but there was some that I thought, I don't know. So, but that whole way of doing business, the RSC way, really stuck with me. When I was with Nations, I would go in and I would do the same type of analysis and say, hey, these are the things they're doing good. And these are the things they're doing bad. And, over the course of time with RSC and with Nations, ran across a few business brokers out there. Didn't really seem to know the industry. There was some that were doing some things that I didn't agree with. Maybe they were taking money from the buyer and from the seller. And, my theory is you got to put on the jersey of one team or the other, and you can't be paid from both sides. And so I felt like that there was a more logical and ethical way of doing things. So in 2000, I left Nations Rent and I switched sides of the table and primarily began representing sellers of rental businesses. And over the years, have done 140 something transactions, a little over 2 billion in value. Um, my sweet spot. One of the things you asked me at the show is what's my sweet spot. My sweet spot is kind of the smaller to medium sized rental companies. I know that you've had Joe Condrup and Catalyst on here, and they tend to go towards the upper end of the range. And, my typical client, maybe they're doing 5 million, maybe they're doing upwards of 25 million. Maybe they're doing somewhere between $2 and $10 million worth of EBITDA. Maybe they got 10 million of fleet. Maybe they got 50, $60 million of fleet. But that's kind of been my bread and butter. I've done some transactions that have been well over 100 million, but honestly, my 80% somewhere in that 10 million to $50 million transaction size. A lot of them are, I use myself. Gary is kind of a dated name at this point. All Garys are 55 to 75, and boy, I'm in that category. And a lot of my sellers are the Garys of the world. Maybe they started the business in the 80s, maybe they started it in the 90s, and this is their single largest investment that they have in life, and they're ready to exit. So they call me, and you and I were talking, and very rarely is that just a phone call and boy, let's go to market today. Oftentimes it's the beginning of a 2-year, 5-year relationship where I work with them, and kind of go through that RSC process with them. Hey, this is what you're doing right. This is what you're doing wrong. These are some holes that I see in your operation. This is maybe what you could do to increase your marketability, increase your exit value. So that's the bulk of what I've been doing over the last 25 years, and prior to that, working as on the acquirer side.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all that. I could tell why you had success in what you're doing, right? You started as CPA, Deloitte, worked in an equipment dealership, started your own equipment rental company, then worked on the M&A, the buy side for RSC, the Nations Rents. A lot of people know Nations Rents, and then switched to the selling side, right? So you have, when you talk to people, you could be like, I've sat on the other side of the table. I've run a rental company. I have a CPA, and I've also sold 140 companies. So your experience is like, if I'm selling a rental company, I mean, that's your sweet spot, right? You've done it, especially in your range you mentioned, $5 to $25 million. When you got into this, when you were, thinking about you became a CPA, then you started working in the rental company, started the rental company. Did you think you'd have a career buying and selling rental companies for several decades?
No, honestly, sometimes I wonder, with my partner that I sold him my share of the business. I often wonder how things would have been different if, honestly, that transaction could have gone either way. I had a client a few years ago, Rolf Helland with Illinois Truck, and he started his company about the same time I started that rental company in Dallas. And Rolf ended up, he had 125 million of fleet. He was on the RER top 100. We got 100 million plus when we sold that deal. And I got to tell you, there was a little bit of me that was thinking, could this have been me? Because he started out with a very similar model that I was using in Dallas at the time. He was in Chicago. I was in the Dallas area. I look at what the Dallas area has done, and I think, boy, if I would have stayed there. But you can't second guess those things. I feel like everything is kind of for a reason, and one step leads to another for a reason. And I'm comfortable with where I at, and I feel like I've been successful in what I do.
For sure. And I think about the impact you've had, right? The 140, individuals and families who this is their largest investment mostly. And I don't know every single transaction you've done, but I have to imagine, given your reputation, you've done the right thing for all of them or almost all of them, right? And that impact is massive for those families.
So one of the things I tell my client is I would never tell you to do something I wouldn't do myself. And I've been in their shoes, and sometimes I get somebody that calls me, and maybe they're itching to sell today, and you look at it and say, hey, that's not the best course of action right now. Or maybe sometimes we get an offer that's not what we would expect, and they say, hey, I'm just not comfortable taking that offer. And I say, yeah, I agree 100%. I wouldn't take that offer either. I mean, we've had more success than failure. My success rate overall is about 80%. So, I do a lot of upfront work and make sure it's not worth going forward unless we're all on the same page. If they think their business is worth 100 million and the numbers and the market say it's worth 50 million, then that's a non-starter. We don't want to waste either one of our time. And I always tell them I'll give you my honest opinion, and whether or not that that is right for you, that's your decision. I can tell you that this is what I believe that the market will bear for your business.
What transactions are you most proud of when you think about the 140? Any stick out to you?
You know, there's the Illinois truck was a good one. And that was the one, I say I'm 80% successful. I'll be real honest with you. I tried to sell that previously and it just didn't happen for a number of reasons. And I stayed in touch with the potential seller. And, I told him, 5 years after the first attempt, I said, hey, I think now's the time to try it again. And we were successful. So that is one that I'm proud of. There's another one that was called We Rent It here in Texas. That was one that for some reason me and the owner, who was substantially older than me, we just kind of hit it off. And he was a no nonsense kind of guy. And he basically said, I want you to be part of my team until we make this decision that we are going to sell. So I started working with them in 2013 and we sold that in 2018. And I look at where they were in 2013 versus where they were in 2018. They were a powerhouse in Central Texas. They had beautiful facilities. They had a new fleet. They were growing at 20% plus a year. They checked every box. And I'd like to think that I had at least some small part in that. The reality of it is they had some great people that were able to carry out the ball, but that was another $100 million plus exit. That particular one sold to H&E. So we had multiple buyers on that. So that's another one. You know, smaller transactions. A couple of years ago, I sold Big Sky Rentals up in Montana. They were on the ARA Market Movers list. Just a fantastic operation. Father and two sons, and we achieved everything that they wanted to achieve. And that's another one that I can really point to. And that's not the $100 million plus deal. That's more like in the 20s. So I can be equally as proud of a smaller transaction as a larger one.
Yeah, for sure. And we talked about the impactor. I think I was reading your website. Did you do Rental Max and John
I
Chinguinet? You
did.
work on that
I
one?
did.
Yeah.
And that's the great thing. Over the years, I'll look at, one of my first clients was Northridge Equipment Rental in California. Now they had 5 or 6 locations in California. Great business, great company. Rental Max is another one that I would put up there. It's just such a great company. And We Rent It was another one. Illinois Truck, and there was one down in South Texas called You Rent It. And all of those were just. And the thing is I'm supposedly this industry expert and consultant and all this, but where I've learned it all? I've learned it all from those guys. Every transaction, you learn a little something from one of those guys, that again, hey, this is what they were doing right. Maybe there was a few things they were doing wrong, but honestly, they were doing more right than wrong.
Hmm. Well, on that note, and by the way, John Chinguinet, he was one of our earlier guests, the episode
Yeah.
number
Yeah.
10 or 11. John's a friend. When you look at the rental companies, you've a lot of pattern recognition as running one, seeing hundreds of these, doing hundreds of deals. What's the separation between the rental companies that are good versus ones that are great? What do you see there?
So one thing that I would say to you is, like Illinois Truck, like We Rent It, they had a leader, if you will, and that leader installed confidence in the in the employees, and they created a culture. And each one of these, be it Raw, for the guy at We Rent It was a guy named Green Smith. They had high expectations of all of their employees. But guess what? They were the same expectations that they had of themselves. And they never asked their employees to do anything that they wouldn't do themselves or that they hadn't done themselves.
Hmm.
And, they also had a way of, and this can be interpreted too broadly. I call it never saying no to a customer. Now, obviously, if you have a customer that wants to rent a zebra for a birthday party, that's a no. But I mean, within reason, you know, they take care of that customer, and that goes back to that oil field thing. And I found that a lot of times these most successful companies, their customers, they listened to their customers, and their customers led them to where they kind of ended up. And they created that culture where they had high expectations of their employees, but then their managers had high expectations of their employees. And it translates to things like, on time deliveries and standards for getting back to a customer when a machine is down. And even little stuff like, it goes to the admin people that the billing is done properly. And every one of them, in their own way, were involved in the community, and not in a whitewash way, like, oh, hey, I went to the Chamber of Commerce meeting this week and shook a few hands and made sure that, my picture was in the, monthly publication. It's like sincere and earnest involvement in the community where they're getting involved. And, here in Texas, we've got a culture of the county fairs and the stock shows. And, a lot of times these are something that are an interest to their children or their grandchildren. And, they're getting involved in the rodeos and the stock shows, and they're known within the community. So I would say those kind of things are, and I've always said, your people will do what you do. And I mean, if you care, you're involved, you have that culture, then that goes to your people. And one of my early mentors in this business, he kind of said it the opposite way. He said, the fish stinks from the head. If you see an
Mm.
organization that's not performing, or their their machines look bad, or their shop looks bad, or their delivery trucks are disorganized, or their whole shop and facility is disorganized, usually you walk into the owner's office and you see the same thing. If you walk into the owner's office, it's neat, it's organized, his truck is neat and organized, that trickles
Mm.
down to the organization. So it's kind of a lead by example, but it's kind of a quietly leading by example. And it's more the creating of that culture where, we're going to be the best.
Mm. Well, that last 5 minutes is the episode in a sense. Like that is what rental companies need to know. There's a lot of stuff we've talked about here, but you ask the question, what makes great rental companies different from their competitors who are more mediocre on average, right? It's the leader, it's saying yes to the customer, and being involved in the community, right? And I
Yes.
think on the
Yes.
on the leadership, and by the way, you could say that about a rental company, probably most any sort of sector as well. What makes a great technology company? What makes a great restaurant chain, right? It's probably the same things. You have a great leader, yes to the customer, and involving your customer base or your community. I think on the leadership side, I think it's interesting what you're saying is it really does start at the top. And how is the leader managing their own life, their own part of their, go to their office. Like in some sense, the simple way of doing this is like you could walk into any rental company and walk into the owner's office, and that'll tell you how the company's probably performing before you look at any spreadsheet. Of course, not one to one, but like it's interesting for you as a CPA finance person. You're not telling me, oh, they have a higher fleet utilization or blah, blah. Those are lagging indicators. What you're saying is it starts with the people and the customer service and the community. Those are the three things that you said makes the difference.
I'm not saying that everything else will just automatically happen from there, but I'm just saying it sets the tone, and generally that does follow. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we see it too. We talk to all these, tons of rental companies, and the people who come on our podcast are ones we think are leaders in the space. And we had on Brett Baker in Texas. Actually, he's in States Rentals, right? And look at what they're doing. I mean, he came to our event, Rental Roundtable Live in Atlanta, and he was the detail he has. It starts with him. He is hyper focused on the details and the people and the customer, and guys like Steve Mao and Rodney Coker and Josh Nickel. There's dozens. John Gigonet was one of them. Like there's so many great leaders in the industry. And I don't know exactly how every rental company is performing, of course, because we're not in that. Like I'm not looking at that daily, but you get a sense of who the top rental companies are based on who the leaders are and how
Absolutely.
they lead.
Absolutely.
That's a good insight there. So I want to talk about your article you wrote. Can independent rental centers survive? You wrote, I think, November 2024. It was a little like I've read it, and it's a little jarring because you're like, well, of course they can, and that you're sort of making the point that it's going to be a little bit harder. So, I mean, let me ask you that question: can independent rental companies survive these next 5 years? I mean, how would you answer that?
So I think the short answer is that most independent rental operators need to step up their game. Okay. For years, and I mentioned this, my dad was full of all of these sayings, and he used to say it's hard to screw up a bowling ball, and I use that analogy in that article. You got this round piece of rubber or plastic, and unless you try, you're probably not going to screw up that bowling ball. And honestly, for years, I mean, I started visiting these rental companies back in the late 80s and early 90s, and I was just, you walk out of there and scratch your head and say, I wouldn't even put my name on the front of this, you
Mm,
know, Joe's rental, it's run by Joe. I'd be too embarrassed to put my name out on that sign. And then, you'd look at the financials and man, it looks like they're doing good. And it was just really easy to make money in the rental industry for a number of years. And I think that some of those companies that were doing it that way kind of got exposed in the '08 downturn. And they had too much equipment and too many employees, and they didn't see what was coming. They didn't track any of their metrics. And I've spent my whole career trying to get it from manual writing of rental tickets to using a rental software package and pulling data out of that. And generally, you have to go through a bunch of Excel and whatnot to get out the data that you need. But I think that that is absolutely what is necessary. And one of the things that I tell my clients is, like Green Smith of We Rent It, for whatever reason, he picked fleet out on rent as his number one metric. And man, he watched that every day. But and that was kind of his comfort zone. You could say, well, maybe he should have been looking at the revenue, maybe he should have been looking at the EBITDA, and he was. But, he kind of looked at that as the start, and then he would get down into the details. But you're going to have to get down into those types of details. I mean, you're battling a lot of times my clients competitors are United and Sunbelt and Herc, and they've got big corporate staffs. They got sophisticated, information systems and whatnot. But I think that they've got to find, be it that fleet on rent, be it tracking revenues and putting the revenues in the proper buckets. I mean, I've had customers that say, oh, hey, we did $100,000 last month, so we're doing good. Well, you look at it, well, they sold a machine for $30,000 that pumped up their revenue. And
mm.
besides that, they were actually down. So, you got to dig deep. And, I encourage people to look at their revenues. Their payroll is always the number one cash expense, the utilization of their rental fleet and their EBITDA, and to track those measures. And then as you get comfortable with those, to add in additional measures. And one of the things that I at the rental show, I heard a lot about AI, and I went to your presentation, and I like some of the things that you guys are doing. But I would like to change AI from artificial intelligence to actionable intelligence. We got we got the rental software system, then we got QuickBooks, and then you had the one guy on that tries to combine all of the different systems and harvest the data out of there. I mean, I think those are the kinds of things that rental store owners are going to have to start looking at that they may not have even managed to years ago. I look at, I'm dealing with a guy right now. He's got 30 million in fleet, something like 2,200 line items. He's got several locations. He's writing a bunch of tickets on a daily basis. And, you think of Niagara Falls and all of that water coming over. And, that's what 2,000 rental items generates, and
Yeah.
100 tickets a day and 400 customers or whatever it is that big waterfall of data. If we can somehow, if I'm going to take a shower, I don't want to go take a shower under Niagara Falls. I want a targeted stream to take a shower under. And that's the analogy I would like to see, is to make it simple for these rental store owners to have their 4, 5, 10 items that they're watching, and to have something like an AI say, these are the items that are most important, to analyze all of that data and pick out the outliers of what's not performing correctly. But I think every rental store owner is going to have to go through that and see what's right for their operation and see what's right for them, to figure out what those 5 or 10 items are. And by God, start tracking it to where it becomes second nature to you, so that when you see that data, you can pick out, maybe the AI has narrowed it down to a certain finite set. And then you pick out the ones that you say, all right, these are the things that are most important to me that I think can have the most impact on the operation.
100%. And I think, as you mentioned, the level of sophistication is increasing, and it's not even like nice to have. It's moving into you have to do it to continue to survive. Right. And
Exactly.
I think and previously, like, you didn't have a lot of that. If you're especially on pen and paper, or you're a legacy software, you don't even have access to all the data you want. Now you have the data, and it's Niagara Falls, and it's way too much data. And what is the one thing I need to know right now? And I think that's a good use case for, we talk about at the show, is these AI agents, right, that are scripted to
Yep.
do one job. And eventually, right, you probably have 3 or 5 metrics, as you say, but the key is synthesizing all the noise. First, it was too quiet. We had no data, and then it became too loud. There's too much noise, and now we need to synthesize that into the one thing you need to know right now. And I think I would just say, on the AI front, like, it is supercharging how fast you can deliver software now. We're seeing it. I'm sure our competitors are seeing it. And I think as you get to the AI ratio next year, certainly 2028, 2029, the level of software that is going to be out there for rental companies is going to be multiple times higher than it has been in the last few years. And what's going to happen is the companies that are embracing the technology, embracing the data, they're going to be able to compete with the nationals, and the ones who aren't are going to be further left behind. And I think, the question, can independent rental companies survive? Yes, they can, but you have to move and you have to adjust, and not everybody's going to make it.
You know, Unfortunately and honestly, I think I even mentioned to you, I'm becoming a little bit of a dinosaur in this industry. I mean, I think that there's a lot of rental store owners that are my age, and I've always been one to embrace technology, that are my age, that are just, it's like the voodoo. I don't want to, I don't want to worry with this, but younger generation that is now kind of taking over. I don't know how old Brett Baker is, but my perception, he's probably in his 30s. Some of these guys in their 30s and 40s that are embracing that. I think that that's the next generation of what we're going to see, and that those guys are the ones that are going to successfully compete. And then maybe the Garys of the world, the 55 to 75-year-olds, maybe that's where I come in, and I'm selling their company for them because they're not willing to do that.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a mindset shift, right? I think it's the people who are going to embrace change, and I think the idea, what got you here won't get you there, right? Yeah, you did a certain way, did pen and paper and legacy software, or old way of doing things. Like, great, you got to this point. I don't know if that's going to get you to the next point. As we talked about, it's getting more competitive. it's changing. I think at a minimum, you need to be looking at your data, right, and on a regular basis.
So one thing too, you know, specialty rental has been the buzzword, and I'll look at somebody like a Brett Baker, and I listened to his episode here recently, and you know, specialty can be more than just, hey, you're trench shoring or you're pumping power or whatever. Um, I feel like within the general rental segment, you can kind of be a specialist, kind of like what Brett was saying on his episode. He targeted one particular type of customer. He made sure that his machines are spec'd for that particular usage. And, he's side by side with them and listening to them as to what their customer needs. And, you know, maybe maybe your specialty is your geography. Maybe it's the type of customer base or the target market that you have. Again, making sure that machine's spec right. Um, and two, if you think about, you're hearing United and Sunbelt or, 30 and 40% specialty. Well, some of that specialty is coming through their general rental stores. You know, definitely start cultivating that as you can. And, maybe you can pick up an employee with specialized knowledge and maybe you can create a division. But maybe your specialty, so to speak, is not necessarily a product line. It's what you do and who you interact with and making sure you're taking care of that particular base.
For sure. It's about focus, right? Someone said niches to riches, finding your narrow piece where you could be the number one player, right? Whatever that is. Keep scoping until you can get there. So,
Yep.
um, Gary, we're out of time here. It's been great having you on. It's great to meet you at the A-Ray show a few weeks ago. Last question I ask everyone: what's the best career advice you've gotten that's helped shape your success?
So keep in mind, I'm an entrepreneur. I've got 40 something years of work experience, and all but about 16 of them has been as an entrepreneur. And somebody said to me, and this is kind of a paraphrase, well, what you did yesterday was great, but what are you going to do today? And honestly, that's the life of an entrepreneur. I mean, you gotta keep it going every day. M&A world. Hey, I closed this deal yesterday. Well, what are you going to do today? It's that continuum that I think is very important. And most of my clients are entrepreneurs, just like I am.
And the listeners who are entrepreneurs know that lesson. I think about Nick Saban when he won one of his national championships. He's at the press conference and like, Nick, what are you gonna do tomorrow? He celebrates the championship. He's like, I'm going on the road. I got recruiting tomorrow at 9 a.m. And
There
everyone
you
was
go.
like,
There you go.
right, that's what it is. Celebrate the moment, celebrate your win. You got work to do the next day. So,
Yep.
Gary, appreciate you having you on. Thanks for everything you've been doing for the industry. And thanks again for coming on today.
Thanks for having me, Kyle.